Let me give you several examples of the Masoretic text. The one to begin with is the traditional Masoretic text as preserved in the Rabbinic Bible. The Rabbinic Bible was edited by Jacob ben Hayim in AD 1524-1525, and it represents the first printed edition of the Hebrew Bible. And this was very important. It was the usual basis for all printings of the Hebrew Bible till 1927. They would simply take the text of the Hebrew, which you can see here on the manuscript. It would take that text, and print that. The Rabbinic Bible has a bunch of other things, commentaries by medieval commentators. It has the Aramaic paraphrase, the Targum, but basically it is also has the traditional Hebrew text, and that's a starting point for the Masoretic text. As far as old manuscripts, the most important one is one called the Leningrad Codex B19A, although now we should probably call it St. Petersburg Codex B19A. It dates to 1008 of the Christian era, and it represents the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. Housed in St. Petersburg, what used to be Leningrad, at the St. Petersburg Public Library. And it was pointed, that is, the vowels were added by Moses ben Asher, one of the last of the ben Asher family of scribes. And this oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible has become the basis of standard critical editions of the Old Testament, such as the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Another important manuscript is called the Aleppo Codex, dates to 925. It used to be the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible that existed up until 1948. But it turns out that in Aleppo, Syria, after they declared that there would be a state of Israel, the Muslims in Aleppo rioted. They burned the synagogue down, and with that, part of the scroll came to be lost, particularly the Torah scroll, or the Pentateuch. But the rest of the Aleppo Codex somehow showed up in the state of Israel a few years later, particularly the prophets, the scroll of the prophets and the scroll of the writings. Apparently the Pentateuch, the Torah, was lost, although we do have a photograph of one page which a fellow named Wicks took in 1887. The Jews in Aleppo were very precious of their manuscript and didn't allow people to touch it or do much with it, but they did allow a photograph of one page in 1887, and that's all of the Torah that we now have. But anyway, this text is now used in Israel as part of a scholarly Hebrew Bible that they are developing in Israel. But it's limited, of course, to the prophets and the writings. Then there is the Codex Cairensis. It's the oldest dated codex or book version of the Masoretic text. Dates to 895, although it only contains the former and latter prophets. Does not contain the writings, does not contain the Torah. But it's older than even the Aleppo Codex. And then also found it in Cairo is a bunch of fragments that were found in what is called the Cairo Genizah. A Genizah was a place for storing away old manuscripts, and they discovered some 250,000 manuscripts and fragments in the synagogue in Cairo, and these were taken over and became part of a collection that's now housed at Cambridge University. It was discovered in the 1890s, And not all the texts that were discovered are copies of the Hebrew Bible. There are other types of manuscripts in there too. But some of these are very old, although they're very hard to date because they're just tiny fragments in some cases. And they haven't been completely studied. So someone wanting to do a dissertation in this field might do well to go to Cambridge. In addition to these Masoretic texts, let me mention a few other old exemplars of the text. One is a quotation from Numbers 6, 24 through 27, which was written on silver amulets. They took a piece of silver, they wrote on it this scripture. They rolled it up and buried it in a tomb that was discovered by Gabriel Bar-Kai. The tomb is an Iron Age tomb, dates to the 600s BC, the 7th century BC. And on it were the familiar words from the book of Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. This represents the oldest extant copy of a biblical verse that's ever been discovered. Another old manuscript that's worth mentioning is the Nash Papyrus. A little bit of debate on the dating of it, but it dates somewhere between 100 BC and the 2nd century AD. And it's a conflated version of the Decalogue, or Ten Commandments, combining aspects of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, both of which have versions of the Ten Commandments. And then it also adds the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But this would be the second oldest fragment of an Old Testament text outside the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now let me say briefly another tradition comes from the Samaritans. The Samaritans preserved the Pentateuch independently of the Jews. They separated from the Jews in around the 2nd century BC, and they accepted only the Pentateuch as scripture. They did not accept the prophets or the writings, but they preserved that Pentateuch, and they still use it to this day. There's still 1,000 or so Samaritans that exist. You see a picture here of some of them celebrating Passover. But the Samaritan Pentateuch is used by Old Testament scholars for text critical purposes. The oldest Samaritan text copy that we have dates to around AD 1200. You can see it has a different script even than the script of the Masoretic text. How does the Samaritan text differ from the Masoretic text? There's several ways. One, there's 6,000 variations, although only about 1,900 of them are considered really relevant to textual criticism. Why do they vary? Well, some were just flat-out scribal errors. Some represent modernization of the grammar, where they kind of updated it for how they were saying it later on. Some represent harmonizations of things that were difficult to reconcile. Some add Samaritan theology, for example, where in Genesis 22, where Abraham took his son Isaac to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. Well, the Samaritan Pentateuch reads Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritans built their temple. It was probably Mount Zion in actuality. But it must be said that even though a lot of the variations are not legitimate, at least in some cases, the Samaritan reading may be, where it differs from the Masoretic text, may be superior to that of the Masoretic text. And so it can be used for textual criticism. In general, scholars consider the Masoretic text the better tradition. But where the Samaritan Pentateuch agrees with the Septuagint, well, that's a pretty good case. That maybe the Samaritan tradition may be better than the Masoretic tradition. In any case, it's very similar to the Masoretic text, and it proves that there has been no radical change in the text in some 2,000 years. We will talk about other exemplars of the texts in the next session.